Hi, I'm Kayva Yang with the Performing Arts at the Walker Arts Center, and I have the great pleasure of talking with movement artist Miguel Gutierrez. And we are about to go into the opening night of Miguel's new work that the Walker is very proud to co-commission, called This Bridge Called My Ass. So we're going to have a chat. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you, Kayva.
It is really a treat to be able to talk with you. I have had the chance to kind of follow some of your work over the years. Even had a chance to sit in one of your workshops and participate. Yeah, so this is for me a different way to get to know your work. So let's have a connection and conversation.
Let's talk it out.
Let's talk it out. So This Bridge Called My Ass. I go to the title first.
Sure.
And I'm assuming in some ways you invite us to do that.
Of course.
So I had a chance to hear you talk on Neil Goldberg's She's a Talker, a podcast that I think everybody should check out. And a question was, titles, do they matter or not matter?
Sure.
And I was so curious that you were like, no, titles do matter. So I went to this title, and This Bridge Called My Ass made me think of This Bridge Called My Back. So why this title and why the nod, and what is it?
Sure. So the reference is to This Bridge Called My Back, which is a third wave feminist anthology of writings that was edited by Cherie Moraga and Gloria Ansaldúa, which I think came out in '81. I hope I'm getting that right.
81.
And it's writings by predominantly women of color, mostly queer women of color. And there's like short essays, poetry. There's the one of my favorite pieces, The Open Letter to Mary Daly by Audre Lorde. And I encountered this book when I was 19 and I was living in San Francisco. I had dropped out of school the first time and was heavily involved in queer activist stuff like direct action protests and through Queer Nation. And I was kind of like living in lots of different places over the course of the year. It was pretty crazy, and I don't remember how the book came into my hands, but this is pre-cell phone era, so when we had like extra time on our hands, we just like read from a book, and this book kind of became like my Bible for the year, and I just would read it throughout my day or whatever I was doing, and I think at the time, I was just, my entry into my relationship to identity, queerness, or being, we didn't say Latinx at the time, but Latin American, Latino at the time, was really through reading the words of women. I was very self-loathing and very suspicious of men, and I didn't feel compelled to go to the words of men, and I felt like feminism had kind of already been hitting all of these points that were of interest to me from a social justice perspective. And that book in particular is sort of looking at questions of identity, questions of justice, and critique of white feminism, right? It's a kind of calling to task certain forces within the white feminist movement that had gone severely overlooked, such as racism, of course, first and foremost, but also homophobia and classism. And so for me, it was just kind of the Bible to intersectionality, really, because when I came out, I did see that as being kind of the bridge, as it were, to a consideration of all of the isms, right? So that book was in my life when I was young, and then I don't remember if it was a couple years ago or if the title was just in my head again. I was thinking about the things that eventually would lead me to make this piece or to put the group together for this piece, and I was brought back to that book, and then I think I went ahead and like kind of reread some of it, and I was struck by I was struck by both kind of like the familiarity of the language, and I was like, wow, I really like took this in. Not that I could remember the specific essays or per se.
But you could kind of feel what you thought of back when you were carrying the book around, right?
Well,
like
and also that
it came
this
up.
language and this way of thinking was so integral to kind of my formation as a political subject, you know, or and then eventually as an artistic one as well. And so I was really kind of like, wow, this is just kind of in me, this thinking. And then the next thought I had was like, the thing that's kind of intense is like, it feels like this kind of writing is what people do now, like in the form of like a Facebook rant or even an Instagram rant. Like these kinds of like, you know, da-da-da-da-da, you know, this kind of like, let me tell you what's going on, you know. And so there was a kind of correlation there that I found interesting but also kind of troubling, thinking like, okay, have our ways of talking about these issues, so many of which are still really, of course, with us, you know, inequity and racism, sexism, all these things, like they haven't gone away. But our ways of talking about them haven't really evolved that much either. And there's almost like a form, right? There's like a form to the rant.
Yeah. And even the book itself, which you talk about the power of words in your own practice.
Yeah.
There is, even for your title, to be able to be a nod. It seems like an homage in some way of that influence.
Absolutely.
But then it's also a shift.
It's absolutely a shift, because I think that the thing that is sometimes missing for me within the discourse of political speech is irreverence and is a kind of the critiquability of the critique, right? And I think something that I think is an inheritance from queer culture and tradition is like the ability to really like question and laugh at everything, even the things that are important, things that are for me really meaningful to hear and to say, but that even that understanding that there's like sometimes too much of a seriousness in that. So I think that's where the word ass came in, you know. At the time, shortly, like when I went back to school when I was 19, and I was good friends with a friend of mine, Angela Robinson, and who is at the time was a theater director and is now like involved in TV and stuff. And a filmmaker, but we would like insert all these kind of words in the place of this bridge called my back. We'd be like, this mess called my life, you know, or this mess called my room, or the, you know, and it was like this, again, this kind of queering of the queer thing, you know, and so I think it was thinking about that as well, like our need to, you know, and she's a biracial lesbian, it's like our need to kind of find humor inside of this thing. So I think that's where that.
And I wonder, you know, I can imagine Gloria Anzaldúa, who's no longer with us, that would kind of, I wonder what she would have to say. And I think something that comes up for me in the spirit of that is putting this book into practice had everything to do with letting the writing live.
Absolutely.
And letting it live in a lot of different ways, including by artists. So I think of, in some ways, This Bridge Called My Back, and then your work, This Bridge Called My Ass, is in some ways perhaps answering a certain spirit or calling in which the book was meant to be, that it lives on in a lot of different ways and influences, including your piece.
Absolutely.
So, something that, when I go into the title, you know, and I had a chance to experience your premiere at the Chocolate Factory, which was fantastic, so congrats on that. There is something about, for me, I felt such intimacy. And it was very much of an intimacy that is with dancers who seem to be creating this world and transforming space. And also the chance to be in such close proximity to each other. And as an audience member, I was like, how much closer can I get to this world? So is intimacy important to your work, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think intimacy is always critical for me, or maybe an understanding of how I'm dealing with proximity and distance. I mean, I think some pieces, each piece has kind of like demands its own way of being seen, and you know, have done all the different configurations that are possible, you know, the audience around, the audience on one side, the audience just sort of standing, you know. I think the way we experience something completely defines how we feel about it. And I think increasingly, I mean, I felt this for some time, but the way that we experience bodies in front of us in some kind of action can be so odd. You know, it can feel like, wow, there's like the decision. If I suddenly say like, okay, now I'm in performance, suddenly the distance between you and I becomes really charged. You know, and then if I move in a little bit on it, then you know, there's a feeling in that. Sometimes I think it's kind of fascinating that we can be so close to each other on stage, audience and performer, and you can almost like have no feeling about the performer. You know, like it's all these different ways in which bodies kind of enact presence or absence. Even in their presence, they can enact a kind of absence, which actually was a big theme of the last show I did at the Walker and Lose the Name of Action. But I think I just want to always remind us that we're all in the same place. It's so simple in a way, but I just want to kind of underscore the idea that live performance is this shared space. I don't necessarily think it's like a shared feeling, because I don't need it to be utopic or for everyone to feel great about it. But just that we're all implicated in this thing together.
And there is a sort of, from my experience, I want to get right up in there.
Yeah.
You know, so it seems to be blurring, you know, the intimacy is both, even if it's not the same felt experience, it's blurring where dancer and audience perhaps live together in this space, even for that moment of the performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sensating, right? There's a sensating experience of watching something and kind of like getting kind of pulled into it.
Is there a bridging that happens,
Yes.
or is it metaphorical, not to be too like, you know, on the nose about it?
In this piece, just even the word bridging is such a ethic in the piece, and we're kind of thinking about that in all of its directional implications. But I think that I don't know, the process of identification, where desire goes in your gaze while you're watching something, I think is something that's like been always a big thing for me to consider. You know, the idea that like there are erotics in the room, and like why are we pretending that there aren't? You know, like I think we're not divorced from that. We're bodies in the space. We're people with you know, feelings and sexualities in the room, and so that also becomes a big way that people see, and that especially dance is in such a long history of its own objectification. So I think I try to kind of embrace that and manipulate it. And in this piece, I felt really critical to do. And
there's something about the way, for me, I found that like the erotic and chaotic come together quite quickly, and also in improvisation. It is, to me, both improvisation, which I'm really curious about your thoughts about improvisation, but it comes out both in choreographically and color, and this white, ultra whiteness. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how color and whiteness and that improvisation is those are choices you're making that are very deliberate, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of like there's two questions there for me to think about, the whiteness thing.
Yeah, I try to smash them
thing.
together.
So formally, well, no, I guess both things kind of were coming around at the same time. The two pieces I made leading up to Bridge was I made a piece in Stockholm on a group of students at a school called Doch. It was for the third year graduating students, like they were about to graduate undergrad. And then a few months later, I went to France and I did a commission for Ballet de la Reine, which is a contemporary company, repertory company in France. Before I went to either of those places, I started working with a group of dancers in New York, because I hadn't been in the studio in a minute, and I thought, okay, well, let me get some of these ideas, like let me get some ideas going here. And it was a, you know, racially not hugely diverse group, but it was a diverse group in New York. And we were dealing with issues of like darkness and light, like closing the shades, taking our clothes off in the dark. So a lot of skin, and based on all these prompts that I was giving them, and I was really intrigued by the direction we were heading in. When I got to Sweden, I was confronted with like an all-white cast, right? And I was like, whoa, it's just like a very different thing to see this material and these ideas enacted by these people than it was to see them enacted by the people in New York. And then again, a few months later in France, it wasn't an all-white group, but it was definitely majority white, and I was also like in Europe, so I was also very aware of the ways in which we're able to kind of talk about racial justice or issues of representation, civil rights, all these kinds of things that we always kind of talk about how terrible things are in the US, but we do have a language to talk about this stuff. We've done the time with these terrible, terrible issues. And it's a lot harder, actually, to talk about some of that stuff in Europe because there isn't that kind of shared language, even in the left. Even for people who consider themselves very enlightened, they can be like really racist without realizing it. And
do you think that there is a kind of, when you're making dances and you're working with dancers, there is no choice necessarily for how you show up as brown bodies, as black bodies, or the ways in which racializing happens in sometimes a dance space? Do you feel that that is something that is already present in the room, or do you feel that in some ways what you're talking about is that can shift?
I think it can shift. I mean, I think it really depends on, well, who's driving the project, what are the thematics of the project, is that something that's being foregrounded in the project? Is it, are you dealing with a kind of society of difference? Are you dealing with a society of difference within a particular identity, which is what Bridge is? I mean, I danced for primarily white choreographers for the bulk of my professional dance career. And so I can't really, I'm not in a position to say like how I was read in that thing, or in those instances. So it's such a tricky, I knew that after those experiences in Europe that I wanted to kind of tease out the way that those feelings were being kind of like repressed or having to be sort of shunted a bit to the side because of the realities of the cast that I was confronted with or working with. All of whom were super lovely, lovely, lovely people. But I was like, what would it be like actually if this room were more pointedly this other thing? And so
you chose your cast members and the dancers that you worked with very deliberately.
Very deliberately,
And in fact, I remember you'd mentioned a little bit about how in developing Bridge, you're all getting to know each other.
Absolutely.
So nobody had really been
working together.
A cluster working together, not in this kind of way,
really.
right?
No,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of who knew each other. I mean, I think there was like passing acquaintances in the room, but
what was some of that process like of developing a practice together, where you're getting to know each other? Is there some kind of, what was it like, and was there some kind of internal archive that you also worked with to be together?
Well, I think people signed on to the project. I had a little bit of writing already about what I was thinking about that I kind of shared with the people in
and I should probably mention that it's you.
Yes.
And
say who's in the piece?
Yes, who's in the piece?
Nivia Pastrana Santiago, Sandra Ibarra, Evelyn Sanchez Narvaez, John Gutierrez, no relation, Alvaro Gonzalez, and then Stephanie Acosta is the dramaturg, and basically at some point we were like, well, you also seem like you're the assistant director. Those are the sort of the cast, and then we have Tuche Yasak, who's the lighting designer, Sarah Laurie, who's the production manager, and Michelle Fletcher, who's my manager. I was looking to like, who is in the kind of contemporary experimental field, and because I was like, okay, this idea of working with an all-Latinx group, well, that could be anything, that could be so many different kinds of populations of people, right? Which was great. Like the question was right there at the outset of like, well, what does that even mean? And then I thought, well, let me, I tend to work with people who I have seen or met, obviously, so it's not like I'm just randomly choosing people. And I also have to have had a moment with each of those people where I'm like, whoa, like something has kind of wowed me about them. So that was true for all the people, but yeah, they didn't know each other. And so the first even just week of rehearsals together, it was a lot of talking. It was a lot of like, what is your relationship to Latinidad? Why are you, what brings you into this room, or how do you feel about being in this room? And yeah, of course, everybody had a really different take on it. Everybody had a really different, and I don't think I actually consciously made this decision while I was asking folks to be part of it, but it just turned out that everyone was bilingual. Everyone was Spanish speaking and English speaking. And so then that quickly went into like, the Spanglish came into rehearsal really quickly. And there are some people who are like native Spanish speakers, like for them, English is the second language.
And there's something that happens. Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about, well, two parts. One is that you just mentioned like Latinidad and Latinx, it has different meanings and senses of home or not home or belonging for different people. And here you are. In some ways, do you feel like you were kind of forming a community of sorts, as a group?
I think that's kind of what happens with a piece. Whether, any piece you make with a group of people becomes a community. I think this one had a particular pressure put onto it or question put onto it because the selection had been about this very obvious thing about us. I think but those were the initial questions, like why is there anything that actually binds us? I mean,
without over determining any of that, right?
Without we didn't even know, because I think as maybe hopefully people realize, it's like the idea of Latinidad is a total construction, or even the term Hispanic or Latino is a construction, right? Like if you're born in Colombia, as my parents were, they may say the word Latino, they may say Hispano, right, like a Hispanic person, but they often are talking much more specifically to like the nation that you're from, like los cubanos, esos puertorriqueños, los mexicanos, like there's a reference about nation, and it's only the sort of phenomenon of the immigrant experience and the kind of way in which we exist in the U.S., where the diaspora is sort of lumped into this one big group name, right? Which serves to kind of like erase sometimes the qualitative cultural differences between somebody from Mexico and somebody from South America or somebody from the Caribbean. I mean, those are really different experiences of Latinidad or even just identity, national identity. And so I think that was just kind of in the room right away. I mean, there was no like, we weren't trying to reconcile like, but you as a Caribbean person, like, how do you relate to me? Like, there was no like, because there was a kind of fluency and a sort of energetic desire to be to right?
And language.
And language
can
so
do much
that.
in language. Language can really do that. And you talk about the power of word. You are not only a choreographer, you're a writer. And in some ways, I find that you make dance, and you wrote a telenovela, telenovela that is a part of Bridge. I don't know if its inception was for Bridge or if it was already brewing. It was for Bridge.
Totally.
Can you say a little bit about like how the power of language plays out for you in Bridge, and in particular why the telenovela genre?
Well, so again, having Spanish as such an easy presence in rehearsal was just different for me. I haven't ever really had that in my work. And I was really struck by what that felt like to, it sounds cheesy maybe, like to feel like, oh, I don't have to choose here. I don't have to code switch in the way that, I don't feel like I have to do like some enormous code switch when I'm in a rehearsal where everyone's speaking English, but it just is like, there's like another layer of intimacy that becomes possible, available for anybody who's bicultural or multilingual when they get to kind of, and when that other language is associated with some concept of home, right? And so much of my life, my relationship to my family was a contentious one, where it felt like my desire to do what I do, dance and performance and in the experimental realm, was at odds with this kind of immigrant expectation of like success and, you know, career that was legible. So then to suddenly have this thing which is such a marker of home be wedded to the thing that I have like identified myself with as a professional artist was just like beautifully disorienting and also unexpectedly grounding. So it was like all those things. In the process of that, so I had started seeing someone, and he watches, or at the time he was watching like an hour of a telenovela every day. And he's black. My boyfriend is black. He's not Latinx. But he does it so he can like learn Spanish, and I think he also does it because he loves telenovelas.
I was gonna say the plots will hook you in.
Yeah.
You know.
So I started watching. He was watching. Am I allowed to say the name of one, or is that like a copyright thing?
I think you could say a thing. We'll find out later, right?
Oh my God, what was it? Dueños del Paraíso, Owners of Paradise, and I started watching with him, and then, you know, my relationship to telenovela was like, I remember my family watching it growing up, my mom watching it, and then like when I would visit South America, people watching it. I wasn't like some big telenovela watcher, but sure, it was in my life, it was in the world. And, you know, again, I was thinking about what are the cultural markers that are quote unquote universal to Latin American culture. And, you know, one of them is music, which is another big aspect of the show. And the other one is telenovela. Because a lot of times it's like a telenovela will come from one country and then it's played in another country, or it's rebranded for that country. You know, it's kind of like what we do with like British shows, right? And so there's like, you know, Ugly Betty, which was Betty la Fea in Colombia, but then there's a Mexican version of Betty la Fea. And then there's like La Esclava Isaura, which is about a slave in Brazil. And then there's like another, I think there's like a Chilean version of it. It's like these different kinds of things.
Yeah. It's constantly shifting.
These little shifts. And so that's the whole thing about translation. That I didn't really understand until later when I went a little bit deeper into telenovela research. But initially watching this telenovela with my boyfriend, I was like, whoa, telenovela is so crazy. Like, it's so wonderfully crazy. And Stephanie had said this thing in rehearsal over and over. She was like, if you take something literal to its like most obvious end, you're back in abstraction. And as I was watching these telenovelas, I was like, it's such a beautiful, I mean, you know, suspension of disbelief exists with all television. There's such an incredible one that happens with telenovela because it's just so insane what happens. And not only is the plot insane, but just like the delivery of the plot is so insane, right? So there's like a form to the acting, there's a stylization, there's a form to the, you know, to the sound, there's all these kinds of things. And that we know are easy to make fun of, but on this other level, it's like this real beautiful acceptance of absurdity. And which is a form of abstraction, I think.
And do you feel like for you in writing a telenovela for Bridge, it's you're pushing all of that kind of aesthetic that becomes something else because of your interest around abstraction?
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, I think also, well, I was also interested in the dynamics in the room. And I was thinking, like, you know, any society of people you put together in a room, in a rehearsal process, in a workstation situation, there are dynamics that emerge, and there's roles that people fall into, whether we like it or not. And I thought, well, telenovela, again, is a great form in which you can take a role and just maximize it or amplify it. And so I did that. I started writing this thing. I did like a 2-page thing, brought it into rehearsal, really like embarrassed or like nervous about it. Everybody was super into it. They were just so psyched to get to act, you know, and to be like over the top. And it was like immediately understood. Like everybody immediately understood the form, which was also so cool. And so I just kind of went from there.
It felt scripted in some ways for the dancers.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was very much. I was thinking.
Yeah, like Sandra. I'm like, oh yes, Sandra.
Yeah. But that's such. You know, there's always the villainess, right? There's always a villainess in telenovela. She's not always the drunk villainess, but sometimes she is. In Dueños del Paraíso, there's a drunk villainess. And you know, there's often like the ingenue. Then there's like the you know, court jester or kind of like buffoon-y kind of person. There's like, you know, the hetero hot guy that everybody wants to get. You know, there's different, and then there's like these weird extra, you know, curricular characters. Yeah, it's like da-da-da-da. So I just kind of, and then I started watching and culling from other telenovelas, and then it just became a super fun thing, and it felt like a really necessary and interesting counter to the beginning to the first chunk of the piece.
I was just going to say that is just entering into the piece of this, world of improvisation that's being developed with the dancers, and actually really starting from Spanish tongue twisters, if I recall. So the way that language is already sort of shaping space in the room, and then moving into improvisation, and then it's, I would say, this counter and contrasting around experimental theater happens with the telenovela, which is glorious because I'm immersed in some kind of dialogue.
Totally.
That I just get lost into what's going to happen.
Right?
You're just really lost into what's in. But that contrasting was a real choice, and I'm curious about, like, in a world of making dance, would you say dance and experiment, these pieces are going together for you? There's no divide. It just makes sense. Or
I think it's two sides of a certain kind of coin.
Yeah.
I think that with the improvisation, we were discovering systems of communication, because in the absence of understanding what Latinidad formally means as a structuring device in any kind of like conclusive way, because I don't think you can get to that per se, there was instead this emergence of a way of being together inside of the togetherness and the difference of who we are. It felt important to kind of resist an easy interpretation or an easy representation through the use of the improvisation with all these different kinds of questions. I didn't want to satisfy some singular representation, right? So we don't, in the whole first chunk of the piece, there's no singular image that gets constructed. It's a kind of evolution of images. And you can miss things, and you can sometimes have things that are obscured based on like the materials, because there's fabrics in the piece that are hanging, and sometimes you literally can't see things, and then they get revealed to you. And all of that, I think, forcing a viewer to kind of build an understanding and then let go of the understanding, and then notice that their attachment goes in multiple directions.
It's almost, to me, if I think about the way language operates, there's no period at the end of the sentence in this first section. Right?
Yeah.
There is also this, I mean, I hear what you're saying as also maybe like a letting go of that precious moment. There is no precious moment to hold on to.
No, and I think there's no precious moment even around the concept of Latinidad. It's sometimes, I think, identity is deployed as a kind of voyeuristic position that feels a little like fixed, or like I'm invisible and you're not seeing me as this thing that I am, and there's a kind of like standing on your feet and like I am this thing, and everyone's like, yeah, you are this thing, and somehow the audience is like comforted into like, well, look, I watched a TV show with like black people on it last night, and it's kind of like, I'm okay, they're okay, and I'm okay because I know what blackness is now, and I think that I understand that transaction. I also think that it's a really confusing one for the artist, As soon as you fight to be identified in a certain way, you're then fighting to not be identified that way. You're seeking agency and self-determinism.
And I think you talked about, as an artist, making some of these choices, and not only for Bridge but for your body of work. We had the pleasure of having you guest edit the soundboard article for the Walker Art Center. And the very question of the article was, why identify identity, or does it exist? And so I feel like what you're talking to is really speaking to that struggling of specificity that you talk about around identity, and also making choices around content, form, pushing an abstraction in a kind of way. These things live together, and not always in a congruent, fixed, if anything, unstable kind of way.
Not always in a heroic way.
Not always.
I think sometimes identity is burdened with the task of heroism or exceptionalism, right? I mean, it's like in Queen and Slim, when Slim has that things like, why we always got to be the best at everything, or why we, you know, like, and I certainly understand this from like the first generation immigrant perspective of like, I will learn English better than all of my peers in class, and I will out English them, you know, and this feeling of like, unless, you know, and all this bullshit we hear about immigration of like, all, you know, everything has to be merit based, unless you're like the absolute positively best fucking scholar of this thing, you were not allowed into this country. It's like, when there's all kind of shitty ass lazy people all over the country who aren't great at anything, you know, who get to kind of exist in peace, you know. And so I think that for me, inviting the possibility of like failure or an abject representation or like an overly sexualized representation or a kind of excessive representation or kind of just confusing one feels really, I don't want to say radical, but it feels critical to me. As a Latinx person, that is like, I don't want to wield this identity as some kind of stick against you of like, but I'm this thing and I know what I am and you don't, and so bye, boom, 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 you know, bat you away, because it's in flux for me too.
And that fluxing, I find with all of the dancers, you know, from the beginning of the piece all the way through, is there is both singularity, where I find that dancers are moving about and choreographically throughout the space, and at different times coming together.
Yes.
Not necessarily any kind of like fixed, here's a duet, here's a moment, here's a trio, here's an ensemble, here's we're all moving in the same direction kind of thing. But there is a fluency across the dancers and choreographically. And then with the telenovela, I find there's a dog figurine. So so can you talk a little bit about that? That for me felt like a real distinct moment. Which,
the dog stuff?
The dog. So this to me was the end of the telenovela, where we are now coming into some abstract, surreal realm where there's a bit of a ritual happening with a dog that's made out of metal pieces.
Metal clips.
And sort of being an object of worship. So objects really play a part in this as well. So can you talk a little bit about how is that for you, where abstraction meets? Is that an experiment for you? Was that something to play with, some kind of figure?
I don't know when it came up. Like, I mean, it's a mix of things, and hindsight is 20/20. But Nivea has a dog, and Sandra has a dog, and they would talk about their dogs a lot in rehearsal. And then they'd like show us pictures of them with their dogs, and then I at one point did like a Google search of like Latin American people with dogs, and you know, again. One of the things that comes up with any kind of identity is this tension between like the universal and the specific, right? The like critical theory idea of like, you can't speak in universals, you know? And then of course, the sort of on the ground, like people who constantly speak in universals, right? Or the humanist tendency towards speaking in universals. And I feel this tension within myself also as a somatic practitioner, particularly, where I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, people are specific, absolutely, but then there's also tendencies, you know, that exist across gender and race and class and size and age and all these kinds of things, right? So, you know, it's always this kind of like tension, you know, again, because I think because of the way that minoritarian identity exists as a political category that is, you know, often oppressed or at the bottom of something, there is a kind of instinct towards territoriality of like, I am this thing and you cannot speak to me about what this thing is. It makes perfect sense that people would be that way or that we would react that way to each other. But then it's like, okay, but y'all got a dog, you know? Like, you know, and is the way you feel about your dog different than the way that she feels about her dog and the way that random person walking down the street, that white person walking in, that black person has the dog, like, you know, and I just think it's interesting, this idea of like this other creature that kind of defies our understanding of these racialized or gendered or sexualized differences, this thing of like this other space that so many people just project onto the dog, you know, or the pet, this thing of like, you can contain the love for me that I can't get from anywhere else, or you can offer this thing to me that I don't have to be anything else to you but this thing. So all these kinds of ideas came up about the dog as this kind of like universal figure, as this kind of like bizarre godlike presence.
And the godlike presence really comes through with the way sound.
Yeah, because it's like this monologue that the dog
literally the booming dog sound.
Yeah, totally.
With its own dialogue.
Yeah.
It is speaking in some kind of way.
It's also proposing that perhaps all of this has been ridiculous. That all of this has been insane. But it's not, you know, it's perhaps an expression for me of my deep-seated doubt in like everything, identity aside from just like everything. And the dog sort of gets to the absolute absurdity of this dog claiming its centrality as the avatar for these questions becomes a kind of symbol for the fact that like, not just like Latinidad or queerness or whatever the fuck identity we've been talking about, but like literally everything.
Yeah.
You know,
and everything also being state of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Because like also this thing of
absurdity
like,
of our state
what are we
of
doing
the world
sitting around talking about Latinidad when like the world's on fire? You know, it's kind of like there's a aspect of that for me, and certainly even when I was 19 and doing Queer Nation, like I would just be I was aware early on of like, wow, we just eat each other alive, and like we're all like freaking out against each other about like this microaggression, or you didn't acknowledge me when I did it, you know, and I'm kind of like, y'all, we're all being stepped on by the same forces. Like, what the fuck? Like, why are we in a battle with each other? And I feel like that hasn't shifted a whole lot, actually. And it's not again, I don't say that from a place like, hey, we all get along place. It's more just an understanding of like, it's just interesting for me to think about how certain kinds of division are politically efficacious for the powers that be, you know, and
there's something about in the piece where even with the dog, like you're saying, there's I'm not going to let go of the dog because it's just such a fantastic moment for me. But in some ways, there is structure to the absurdity, and then the dismantling of that structure over and over again. But you still are in a space of like these lush, cozy fabrics in a color palette that really, in some ways, has a very loving quality to them, right? So you have these objects that are also throughout the piece. And so I do find that in the absurdity of the world, maybe if we can kind of go in that direction, there's also this comfort and there is home. Not that they're you know, opposites, but I still found that toward the end of the piece, you know, this bridge called my ass is not a completion, but it is taking me somewhere. Yeah. It is, and so I'm just wondering for you how this piece, you know, at the end of a piece for an audience member, even for the dancers, you know, how does it live on for you? You know, is it, does it go anywhere for you? Yeah. Well,
there's a couple of things about this piece that feel really different than other pieces I've performed. I'm not forcing a catharsis onto this piece that I have often in my work. I don't particularly go through a traditional catharsis or a kind of sentimental, like, oh, and now we're really talking about the real thing. The piece doesn't really do that, which I feel really great about that. Partly because I don't feel as susceptible to injury afterwards as I often do after my work in the past. Like I feel like sometimes in previous work I make myself so vulnerable that I feel really just raw.
You mean like you really lay it bare?
I lay it bare in a certain kind of way that I feel, I'm just really fucked up afterwards. Yeah. there's a time and a place, right? And I have, I just recently made a piece about my father who passed away last year that very much does that. So it's like, apparently it's not out of me yet. But with Bridge, I don't feel that way, partly because I feel really held by the society of who we are with each other, and the way that with the communication and the system of communication is really activated between us. So it's not like us versus them, but I definitely feel like protected by the rules that govern our relationships to each other. And that makes it feel very different. I'm not on my own. I'm not on my own out there being like, this terrible thing happened to me.
And that seems like
it's very
different process.
It's very different. It's a very different feeling. And then I think also it's a very different relationship to the audience. It feels really like, this is always true, but I feel very aware that the audience is there to witness and to kind of enter to the extent that they can. I think the presence of Spanish obviously means that there's going to be certain people in the audience who are really in because they speak Spanish or because, and there's going to be people who are like, because they don't. And that can be true of Latin Americans who are in the audience who don't necessarily speak Spanish. So it's not about exclusively a code of like, you're on the in because you're this person and you're on the out because you're that person.
You're experiencing the piece slightly in these varied ways, though.
But but that's always true.
Always true.
That's always
Absolutely.
true in a piece. Like I think
even
any
to
piece,
where you sit.
Any piece, and where you sit. But any piece has its insiders and its outsiders. Yeah. Any artwork, and so I think that this is maybe just kind of making it more obvious. But so I feel really differently after this show is over compared to other shows, and I really love that about it. Yeah.
Do you find too with audiences, this Bridge called My Ass has now had a very successful premiere at Chocolate Factory. It's gone to Montpellier in France, that you already have a relationship there with. It's been to TBA at Portland, and now we're so fortunate at the Walker to have you here. So you're kind of like on this touring of sites.
Yeah.
And so just thinking again about audience, what are you hearing or even observing about the way that Bridge is being experienced?
Yeah.
And by received is a little bit of I want to.
Sure.
Sometimes it's tricky. It's not a review per se, but
Sure.
Even just along the lines of what we're talking about, like, what are you just noticing about how audiences, experience the work?
Well, so there's the way you notice things in the moment of performing that is a particular read based on projections of what you think people are going through, which may or may not be what they're going through, because you don't really, you never know. You never know, right? We all know that. As performers, there's that person in the audience who's giving you stank face the whole time, and then afterwards they're like, I loved it. So you're like, okay, I just really don't know what people think. I will say my experience when we performed in Montpellier, which was the first, we did two shows, and the first show was, I think, almost entirely a white French audience. I felt really aware of the fact that the piece does not service easily the colonial gaze. I was like, oh, this is really not just delivering something on a platter for this particular perspective. And I was really aware of kind of the unruliness of our presence inside of what felt like a very bourgeois way of receiving. That's what I could read, right? And again, I'm projecting or whatever, This is not any slight on, the intelligence of the audience or anything like that, which, it's a very sophisticated audience. But this feeling of like, I think for the Euro gaze, sometimes when they're encountering otherness, they want to right away consume it. There's like whatever. That's the history of imperialism, right?
That is the colonial gaze with a paid ticket.
Yeah. And I think the piece doesn't do that. Like, it doesn't make it okay per se. The telenovela might, if you're kind of just able to like have a laugh, and some people certainly could. But I think for other people, there's like a feeling of like, what are these people doing in front of me, and the relentlessness of it, or the kind of untidiness of it. And so there was a little bit of, I felt that kind of perception, and as a choreographer, you also get fixated on the things that appear critical and that people say to you. And I remember this one choreographer afterwards just being like, yeah, I don't know, that first part, I just don't know. You know, like, it's kind of like, I just don't know. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you just don't know, exactly. You know, and you know, often in Europe, there's this language of like, is it strong or did it convince you? It's always this kind of language of like this pseudo-legalese language of like, I wasn't not convinced, you know?
And that speaks to sometimes, do you find that the way dance, abstraction, experimental performance, it has a certain canon and a genealogy, right? So if it's not following that particular kind of canon and lineages, it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, and a certain kind of aesthetic expectation and a certain kind of boundary of what is seen as like, you know, good or high art or whatever, you know, all that stuff's in there. All that stuff's in there. It felt really different in Portland. I mean, it felt really even different the second night in Montpellier because there were a lot of Americans in the audience, some of whom we know, but also just like Black people and like some brown folks were in the audience, and that just already like shifted something in the room. In Portland, it was very different because I think there's a kind of, again, a fluency, if not with the exact particular issues that drove me to make the piece, an understanding of why this kind of thing would want to exist. And so I think that just created such a different thing and a kind of a, you know, I feel like in the US, I having toured a couple different places, it's like, yeah, people in Minneapolis are down, people in Portland are down, people in Philly are down. It's like, people are kind of ready for like, to like get messed up in some way.
And even they're hungry. There's a desire there.
Yeah, so I think it's a different thing than when you're in kind of like what is the pinnacle of a certain kind of a European market system, where there's a consumability in all directions because it just is like, you know, moneyed and there. and I think, you know, we know in the US it's like our ability to kind of attach ourselves to things that we really love that actually travel throughout the country is a much more limited thing. So I you know, that's the perception I'm having. I think I'm also kind of, what I don't know or am sort of curious about is for the people who have seen my work in the past and kind of where this piece exists in relation to the previous work, and so kind of what experience they're having, and the way that the piece, again, formally is a real disavowal of any kind of easy delivery of, like you said earlier, like the duet or the trio or the thing, you know, the kind of like, yes, now the central solo begins. You know, like there's literally nothing that does that.
There's nothing that does that. There is nothing. In your own practice, which for a minute I'll say is not always about making a show.
Sure.
But in your own practice in the pieces, you're looking to, as a disciplinary artist, which I think is a complex word to use sometimes. So I will just say you make dance, you write, you're working on actually a TV episode with, and I believe around your own father's.
Yeah, my sister and I
with
were
your
writing
sister
a TV show together.
Yeah. So it sounds to me too like anyone who is following your work or has seen your work knows that you may be moving in a multi-directional kind of way all the time. And I'm curious for you then, if Bridge is significant, it feels really different from your other work. What does that mean for your interdisciplinary practice? Do you find that, there's a wide open field happening here that wasn't available before, or it's something else? Is it changing that interdisciplinary practice for you?
I don't know. There's a change. I mean, I think there's a skill set that has evolved. You know, like in terms of making sound and just having some more resources and chops in terms of making. You know, because of my familiarity with software or whatever. Certainly there's like an aesthetic kind of like accumulation, knowing what's come before and not wanting to just replicate the same old thing over and over. In terms of the different disciplines that, like, I think that because my sister and I were working on this TV show, I felt like I could write the telenovela, you know, I could engage genre, you know, as a thing to try to do. I don't feel, and I haven't felt for a long time, a sense of limitation of, I'm not allowed to try this, but I'm allowed to try that. No, I think it's like, I think at some point, I can't pinpoint exactly where it was, but even by the late aughts, that I had kind of like, I had so really let go of feeling like I didn't have the permission to try all these different directions, or at least have a feeling about them. And that was, you know, that was just a natural evolution of my own history because of my intimate working relationships with Lenore Doxey, who was the lighting designer I worked with for 15 years, who was such an extraordinary artist, and I felt like I learned so much about light. And then my early collaborations with Jamie Fennelly, who composer and musician, and how that relationship keyed me in and tuned me in so intensely to thinking about the presence of sound in the room. So I think that I had these like really pivotal figures in my life. And then when I started to kind of, I mean, I don't do the lighting for my show, but I certainly have lots of feelings about it. And when I decided to kind of go more into making sound or the writing I'd always felt comfortable with that because that's something I've been doing since I was young. I just felt like this ability, or I feel this ability to be like, yeah, I can hold this, I can do this, I can go in this direction, and it's like it's really fun for me. Like it's just a way of identifying joy in a process, and you know.
And there's something a little bit when I see the way bridge is. I don't want to say performed, but the way bridge is performed, maybe. It doesn't feel like here are these disparate parts of some kind of interdisciplinary practice or whatever. It's actually these weaving together of sound and light and color and text and writing, and it's evolved out of a group. And so to me, it seems like an amalgamation of so many of your different ways of pulling, and that anything is really available, if possible. And you make those choices out of it.
Well, because I think also the thing that performance can do so beautifully is this kind of sensorium space. Like it's this like weird perceptual activated space, and one of the things that kind of I define as the choreographic for myself is the interchange and the kind of relationship of these different sensory elements and how they're moving in relation to each other, like when the brightness happens and then compared to the silence, compared to the loudness, and those kinds of ways in which those associations between sensory experience are the way that we construct meaning. It's always true, but in performance, that's a place where we can really kind of get into the lab of what that feels like for us.
And there's a kind of scale that I find that you're, kind of now zooming out of bridge as a piece and as your practice, and kind of looking at, here you are, bridges touring around the, U.S. and Europe, and performance, and as an artist who has a body of work that's developed over, the Walkers had a relationship with you since 2008.
Yeah.
We're going to go on another 20 years. Right?
I hope so. Yeah.
Performance, the way performance is supported, the way, touring is not an easy process. Walker's so proud to commission, but, we know that presenting also on our end, it's looking at how do you do this in collaboration with artists. So for you and this experience of bridge and other works that you've done, what do you see as the landscape for, how is your experience, both as the artist side and with host organizations, and how you make bridge possible? What are you gleaning from that? Now this gets into this is the stuff, yeah.
Well, I mean, way before this piece even, like, I think, for many years now, it has felt like the field, there's a kind of desire for, what can be quick and easy and cheap, right? Which makes perfect sense, right? That's true, like, everywhere, right? That's true from, like, ordering a Uber to,
but in dance, would that be like quick and easy? Like, here's a piece.
It can go up, it can go down, and it can go up in a day, it can go down in a day. There's like maximum 3 people on stage. The cost ceiling is X. And I think that those kinds of structural and economic expectations and, limitations very much are potentially in conflict with the imagination of an artist who wants to work in a different kind of way. Maybe somebody who wants to work over more time, or somebody who wants to work with more people, 5 people, not 3. Somebody who doesn't want to tour solos for the rest of their lives, somebody who doesn't want to have their work contingent on the charm of their actual physical presence in the work, there's so many different kinds of things there. And then also having been in the field for some time now, the kind of economic expectation and realities of my life, which are really different at the age of 48 as they were when I was 35, and obviously even before that. So how does the structure of the field acknowledge that? Can it acknowledge it? Like, do funding structures acknowledge that? And so I think it's really tricky.
It's really tricky.
Yeah.
We're like, it's really tricky.
Yeah.
There's something you just mentioned about, not necessarily wanting to solo tour, and perform, and then having to, chapters of life for artists really, like every life, change.
Yeah.
And so then how does funding really support the world of dance and performance is a big question. The field, I think a question the field's asking, but for artists, it's oftentimes on the grant side. It could oftentimes be on, the relationship side, and also having to be your own operation. Operation, even if you're not a company that has a group of, a cast or company members year round.
Group,
right.
So, the story of the making of Bridge is that I applied for a bunch of stuff that I didn't get. And I did get one thing. And I'm not saying that as like poor me. It's more just like I found myself in this strange place where I felt so excited about what I was doing, and I felt so clear. I mean, not that I knew what the piece was going to look like, but I felt so clear about what my questions were and about what my interrogation was, and I felt so strongly about the collaborators I had, and so excited about that. And the fact of the matter is that no amount of your personal excitement guarantees you anything financially, And there were a lot of practical considerations that came up in that process of like, oh shit, like because I pay people, I try to pay them decently. 2 of the collaborators were from out of town, so I was like flying them in. It's usually the thing that like, you make work for X amount of time over a longer period of time, right? So it's like 20 to 25 weeks over like an 8-month to like a 1.5 year long period of time because of the different kinds of work commitments that I have and that the people I'm working with have. So there's a kind of need to find a way to keep them, to like have a financial incentive that they'll come back. And when all those kind of grants fell through, and not that I had been like expecting that I just deserved all of them, but that I was kind of counting, I thought, okay, well, this will probably happen, this one, maybe not, whatever. But when that landscape collapsed a bit under me, and I was like, this is so confusing to me. Like, on one hand, I'm getting messaged by the field like, you're at the pinnacle, like you got this amazing award last year.
Yeah,
or you,
visibility.
You're a rock star. People will say this word to me, like, I'm a rock star. I'm like, oh, I feel like a rock star. I feel like a really stressed out emailer, like a person who's just like constantly on the computer.
Which is the parentheses of the choreographer.
Yeah, it's like you're ironically, people are like, oh, you're just like moving in the studio all the time. I'm like, girl, I'm spending 6 hours in front of the freaking computer trying to get a damn grant. Like I'm not like living this like calorie burning life that you think I'm living. So when I was confronted with those 2 really clear things of like, you're not getting the support that you need for this project, and everyone's like, you're amazing. I was kind of like, I don't get it. Like why can't I, like if I see myself in a certain place and I'm kind of being told by some group of people that I'm in a certain place, why can't I just get the support that I need? Like why don't, there's a, so this thing that like And this is true of every single artist in the US, that anytime you start a project, you're at zero. You're at zero. You don't, nobody comes from the previous project with a profit. Like nobody, zero, nobody does. Everyone, if anything, people are recuperating debt from their previous project. And to think that no level of sort of stature or success or an 8-page resume, which is what I have, can guarantee that. So
and that's kind of a myth about, oh, here's an established artist.
It's just happening for
and they're
them.
touring.
It's just working.
Right, and
touring.
The scale also somehow equates with sustainability.
Sure.
That's not
really Bridge is touring.
case.
Bridge is, again, not to be like, poor me. Bridge is touring, sure. It had 2 tours last year, let's be clear. Those are 2 weeks out of however many weeks there are in a year, 52 weeks, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, those 2 weeks don't pay for the rest of my life, you know? So even there, I think it's about kind of understanding something about when we think that someone's going through some great thing, because we're all sort of dealing in this economics of poverty in the art world. Anybody who achieves even a modicum of success, or who achieves a good amount of success, we think, well, they're set for life, obviously. Like, they got that one thing, well, now they're just good, And it's kind of like, whoa, that's just not the way it goes. Everybody's award money runs out. Everybody's like one tour ends, It's like, and then, there's obviously tons and tons of people who aren't even able to access those incredible privileges. So there's
and
like,
I think
that's
to
the
me,
whole thing.
When you're talking about the story of Bridge of like 2 weeks out of the year or touring, which is just artistically, there's so much that's growing and developing out of that, but at the same time, you're speaking to something that's rather systemic, because like you're saying,
it's absolutely systemic. I mean, because
every artist, not one particular kind of artist.
And especially in the US, where there's such a limitation of places that you can present this kind of work, or who are able to have the resources to present this kind of work. It's like, you and I can name it on 2 hands, what those places are. So I think, again, and that's another place where as an artist you feel a bit limited, because it's like you want to dream that your thing can be seen anywhere and everywhere. And I have friends who are like, well, why aren't you bringing this to such place? And I'm like, they don't have the resources. I bring 10 people on the road with me for this project. Like 10 incredibly talented, smart people. All of those people deserve to be compensated at really high levels for their labor and their presence. And so that's not something that can just kind of go anywhere. And so, all of which is just to say that the thing that really came out for me in the process of making Bridge was my understanding that like I couldn't imagine another system, for making work.
If there's not another system yet, is there a
Please
conversation?
email me with your solutions. I need to know. I'm not trying to be
Email.
nihilistic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, just give me a call. Text me.
If there's not yet a system, let's say, is there a conversation that you feel like is important to be had in the performance dance field, where artists and host organizations, and perhaps even I include myself in that as well, that either is happening now, or at least we want to have a little bit more of?
I mean, I think the conversations have been happening. I don't see that. I don't say any of this as if the field doesn't know this. Like I think everybody understands that we're all kind of like we're all on this like massive ship that's in a constant state of sinking, and like we're all bailing the water, and then it kind of runs another go, and then it's sinking again, and everyone's like involved, right? From the crew down in the basement.
Right, there's a whole ecosystem around
there's a whole thing, and I think the things that are confusing to me are the fact that we can't talk about sort of statures in the field and kind of the compensation changing as you go through your career, and how that support can and must shift and change, but then also this way in which there are so many small opportunities for people in this field. I was mentioning with you earlier, like even in New York, it's like there's so many tiny little showcases. Like you can show your work, like if you're a young dancer, performer, or maker, like there are opportunities, but all of those opportunities are like these micro opportunities, and they all provide these micro fees, none of which are big enough to certainly not to pay for the thing you just made, and certainly not to pay for your life, So it's almost kind of, you're always in a kind of hobbyist or extracurricular relationship to your art form. platform. And I just wish that collectively as a field we could kind of find a way to pool our resources and get more, bolster these things so that we can provide more to people. And one of my big pet peeves is, again, I'm not going to name names, but granting organizations that you apply for money and they give you half of what you ask for, and then they put out their email, look at all the people we applied, we supported this cycle. And I'm like, yeah, all those people you applied at half of what they asked for. But of course I know, because in the US we're obsessed with quantity, right? So we want to be like, I supported 600 artists last year. It's like, yeah, you gave them each $1. You could have given it to that big pool of money to 2 people so they could actually do something more significant with it. But then you're right back in the question of well, which 2 people?
Yeah.
And then what does that mean about the 598 others? So it's I completely understand. We're just in this Gordian knot, we're just totally. But those for me are the issues in a way. This way in which we kind of just plaster and spread out the support, And I was reading this speech by Marianne Barker, I think it's her name, is the head of the NEA, and she was saying, she cited this statistic which I wasn't aware of, which is that the NEA provides money to 700 something counties in the country, and provides more support to counties where the top 1,000 foundations don't support. So the most of the foundations in this country, I guess, support urban artists, right, or artists in sort of dense population centers. And yet there's the rest of the country. Yeah. So the NEA tries to fill in the gap. And she was saying that from a place of we can't replace public money with private money because private money isn't doing the job, And
I think this is something that and so well that artists do is distributing of resources and redistributing those resources amongst ourselves.
Absolutely.
And what happens in a larger sort of art ecosystem in these conversations is perhaps also, how do we generate more of that resourcing that isn't just from within, but is coming from multiple places? And there is always that question of, well, then from where? But I think what you're pointing to is something that, for art institutions, for arts funding, for artists, and for touring, and this is the conversation of our time too.
It's very confusing because we are living in another gilded age of philanthropy, right? So we're living in this period where a lot of these tech titans are just so unbelievably wealthy, proportionally more wealthy than, I think the Carnegies or the Rockefellers who started the initial foundations that support the arts. And so many of them start foundations or cherry pick projects to support or sort of specific public policy issues or social justice issues. There's so many different conversations to be had there. First of all, should a person who's made their career in a particular technological field then suddenly become the leader of an altruistic organization that they have absolutely no experience in? Also, doesn't that then kind of just support this oligarchy of rich people deciding where they want their money to go? Also, shouldn't they just pay their fucking taxes? So that all that money can go into the tax system, so then we can get state funding or we can get universalized healthcare. Any amount of that money could go into the economy in a really different way. And it's and also before we get into any of that bullshit, why is Bezos making so much more money than the entry-level worker at Amazon? Just from a wealth inequality standpoint, it's just morally incomprehensible that there can be that disparity.
And these questions about how do we really not only supporting artists, but what are the ways in which the arts and culture and the creative labor behind that are supported, right? In any kind of larger social society, we could even look at a neighborhood level. So I think about what is it that the arts in society, in a neighborhood, in a city, how can it be supported? It begins with perhaps artists, creative people, creative endeavors that may or may not look like a particular kind of specific arts.
Sure.
And so those are the things that I hear you saying too, is like, we don't even have to just think about what's happening in dance and performance as a field. We should and we can, but we can also look at, this is something going on systemic across.
Absolutely, it's
So
affecting
that's-
everybody.
yeah.
I mean, but it to tie it back to bridge, it's something that what you just said makes me think about is how, again, to go back to this kind of initial thing of like this tension between content and form, or abstraction and race, or whiteness and artists of color, or artists who are racialized. Artists who are racialized are burdened with speaking to the community, right? To represent, and often heroically, right? To reflect back to the community the sort of exceptionalist narrative of like, I made it, and like, come on, Kayva, I'm gonna pull you up, which is, of course, beautiful and a reality in the field. But what happens if, as an artist of color, you're not making that kind of work? What if you're not making your work to sort of like uplift the community? Not because you're a jerk, but that's just not where your work is going.
Right.
Or that's because that's not what your life experience is.
And where your imagination is being contributed and takes you.
So for me, this is a whole
Yeah.
other part of the conversation, and again, that does speak to money again, right? Because of the NEA culture wars of the 80s, 90s, where so much of this anxiety emerged around like, we can't give money to individuals because individuals might go ahead and just make what they want to make. Oops, instead let's give to organizations because we can spread it out, and also then we can kind of like distance ourselves from the content of what that terrible individual artist is going to make, especially if they're queer or making anything that has anything to do with sex or issues that we think are scary or icky. Then that kind of neutralizes the field in a way, and it's sort of, and then ironically also is asking these organizations to pick up the slack of support in the community that the government no longer wants to do. And it's like, that's why the government, that's why public schools lose their arts education programs, and then you have all these little like private-public partnership organizations that like come in like, oh, we're gonna be your after-school program.
And it's really, I think, to me, if there was sort of an umbrella way of having a conversation, it's like, what are the ways in which we're supporting imagination that we're going in now and into our future? That's such a massive conversation. And I would say
it's
that's
being
definitely
privatized.
Being privatized.
Left and right.
And this is our part 2 conversation.
Yeah. Sorry, we're like,
we're there.
Hot.
But I really want to thank you because your story of Bridge is very much, congratulations on such beautiful work.
Thanks.
And not only are you touring, but for us to be able to hear a little bit about the insight that you're experiencing as you do Bridge, and certainly even the story of Bridge that has relevance for dance artists, performance, how we let our imagination be irreverent, unruly.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Miguel.
You're welcome.
And see you opening night.
All right.